Welcome to Spicy Family Scandals, where real-life drama meets hard-earned wisdom. Today's story is about betrayal, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Let's dive in.
Are you really going to serve that? Sandra's voice sliced through the kitchen like a cold blade, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at the dish I'd spent 6 hours preparing. She wasn't whispering. No, she made sure everyone could hear. The clatter of plates and glasses in the dining room fell silent as her words hung in the air. I froze mid-step, holding the serving tray with my beef Wellington, a dish I'd practiced all week for this dinner party. My palms were slick with nervous sweat, and my stomach churned. But this wasn't just about the food. It never was with Sandra. "Excuse me?" I managed to say, though my voice came out quieter than I'd intended. She smirked, swirling the wine in her glass like she was auditioning for a soap opera. I said, "Are you really going to serve that? I mean, bless your heart for trying, but you can't expect people to choke down something so amateurish." The room erupted in awkward coughs and nervous glances. Ethan, my husband of 16 years, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, staring at his lap. Typical. He never defended me. Not against her. I set the tray down on the table, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with the effort it took to keep myself calm. Sandra had embarrassed me before. Oh, she perfected it. Little digs and pointed comments delivered in public or in private, wherever she could wield the most damage. But this was something else. She wasn't just attacking me. She was humiliating me in front of Ethan's colleagues, people I'd never met before tonight. I scanned the room. Alan, Sandra's ever-silent husband, sat stiffly, pretending to study the wine bottle in front of him. Ethan's boss, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire, exchanged a glance with one of her colleagues. The look was clear. What the hell is going on here? And then there was Ethan, still mute, still useless. Well, Sandra pressed, her eyes glittering. "Are we eating? Or should I order something edible?" I didn't answer. Not immediately. I just stared at her, feeling something shift deep inside me. It wasn't sadness or anger, not the kind I usually felt when she tore into me. No, this was something darker, sharper, a spark igniting in a way I hadn't experienced before. I forced a smile and reached for the carving knife, my movements slow and deliberate. "You're absolutely right, Sandra," I said, my voice suddenly steady. "Maybe my cooking isn't quite up to par." I held up the knife, letting it catch the light as I turned to face her fully. "But tell me, have you ever wondered how it feels to be on the receiving end of a knife, instead of just twisting one into someone's back?" The silence was deafening. Every eye in the room was on me. Even Sandra, who thrived on confrontation, looked momentarily unsure. Good. Let her squirm. I wasn't about to make this easy for her, or for anyone else who thought they could push me around. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "No one's twisting anything. It's just constructive criticism." I smiled again, wider this time, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Constructive? Oh, honey, let me show you what constructive really looks like." And with that, I set the knife down, pulled off my apron, and calmly walked out of the dining room. But I didn't go far. No, I had a plan, a way to show Sandra, Ethan, and everyone else in that room exactly what I was capable of. Because this wasn't about the food anymore. This was about taking back control, and I wasn't about to let Sandra have the last word. I didn't leave the house, not yet. Instead, I went to the kitchen, closed the door behind me, and leaned against the counter, letting the muffled sounds of awkward conversation filter through the walls. My hands were shaking, but not from nerves. It was adrenaline. For the first time in years, I wasn't swallowing the humiliation Sandra had served up. No, tonight was different. Tonight, I had no intention of fading quietly into the background. I took a deep breath and opened my laptop, which I'd hidden earlier under a stack of cookbooks. I'd set it up in case I needed to refer to my recipes, but now it had a much more important purpose. Quickly, I navigated to the folder labeled Receipts, a digital collection I'd been curating for years. You see, Sandra wasn't just a mother-in-law with a sharp tongue and an inflated sense of self. She was a master manipulator, A queen bee who thrived on tearing people down to keep herself on top. And she was messy, so messy, in fact, that she'd left behind a trail of breadcrumbs that I had meticulously collected over the years. From emails she'd accidentally sent me, trash-talking Ethan's career, to a voice memo I'd recorded of her mocking my infertility during a heart-to-heart she forced on me years ago. Sandra had built her kingdom on lies, and tonight, I was about to topple it. But first, I needed the right moment. I stepped back into the dining room, laptop tucked discreetly under my arm. The tension in the air was palpable. The guests were all speaking in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with Sandra, who was busy pretending she wasn't the center of the storm. Ethan's boss, Claire, raised an eyebrow as I reappeared. Her curiosity was piqued, but she didn't say anything. "Sorry to interrupt," I said with a calmness that surprised even me. I set the laptop on the table, right in front of Sandra. "I just realized I forgot to share something with everyone here tonight." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Sharing a little context," I said, plugging the laptop into the TV mounted on the wall. Within seconds, the screen lit up with a video, a candid recording of Sandra from 6 months ago, standing in my kitchen during a family gathering. She was talking to her daughter, Meredith, unaware that I'd left my phone recording on the counter. "If I had to guess," the Sandra on the screen was saying, "I'd say Ethan only married her because he felt sorry for her. I mean, look at her. She's barely got a career, no kids, and that house? It's a disaster. But I suppose some people are content to settle." The room was dead silent. I didn't even glance at Sandra. My eyes were on Ethan, who looked like someone had just punched him in the stomach. "Turn that off," Sandra hissed, her face redder than I'd ever seen it. "Oh, I'm just getting started," I replied. I clicked to the next video, this one an email exchange where she'd called Ethan's promotion a fluke and suggested to his boss, yes, Claire, who was sitting right there, that he wasn't ready for the role. Claire let out a low whistle, her expression unreadable. "Well, this is enlightening," she murmured. Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is this?" I turned to him, meeting his wide-eyed gaze. "This is the truth. The truth about how your mother treats me. The truth about what she really thinks of you. And the truth about how I've stayed quiet for years, trying to keep the peace." My voice cracked, but I didn't let it stop me. "But tonight, I'm done. I'm done letting her walk all over me, and I'm done pretending everything's fine." Sandra stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "This is absurd," she shouted. "Ethan, are you really going to let her humiliate me like this?" Ethan looked at her, then at me, his face pale. For once, he had no words. And I didn't care. "Humiliate you?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Sandra, you humiliate yourself. I'm just holding up a mirror." Before she could respond, I clicked to the final file, a photograph of her sitting in an intimate cafe with a man who was most definitely not Alan. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. "Oh," I said casually, "and here's a little bonus. I thought you might want to explain this one to Alan." Sandra gasped audibly, her carefully constructed mask of superiority shattering in an instant. Alan, who hadn't said a word all evening, stood slowly, his jaw clenched. "I think I've heard enough," he said, his voice quiet but firm. And just like that, Sandra's perfect world began to crumble around her. Sandra stumbled back into her chair, her face drained of its usual smugness. For a moment, she looked genuinely shaken, but it wasn't remorse. It was fear. The kind of fear that sets in when someone realizes they've been caught. Everyone else at the table sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Ethan's boss, Claire, had a sharp glint in her eye, as though this dinner had suddenly become far more interesting than any networking event she'd attended in years. Alan, usually quiet and submissive, stood rigid beside Sandra, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was expressionless, but the tension radiating off him was impossible to ignore. "Who is he, Sandra?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Sandra opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting between Alan, me, and the still glowing screen on the TV. It's not what it looks like," she finally managed, though even she didn't sound convinced. I stepped closer to the table, folding my arms. Oh, please, Sandra. We all know exactly what it looks like. The real question is, how long have you been lying to Alan? Or is this just a new hobby for you? You don't know what you're talking about, she snapped, her voice rising in desperation. But the cracks in her composure were impossible to miss. Ethan, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, finally spoke up. Mom, just stop. He looked up, his face a mixture of disappointment and something else I couldn't quite place. You've been tearing everyone around you down for years, and now this? Why? Sandra turned to Ethan, her expression softening, as if she still believed she could manipulate him into taking her side. Ethan, sweetheart, you don't understand. I was just trying to protect you. Everything I've ever done was for your benefit. Protect me? Ethan repeated, his voice rising. By sabotaging my promotion? By treating my wife like garbage? He gestured toward the screen, his hand shaking. By having an affair behind Dad's back? Alan's face hardened. So it's true then? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sandra's mask finally cracked. She slumped in her chair, suddenly looking years older. Alan, please, let's not do this here, she whispered. Alan let out a bitter laugh. Why not? You don't seem to have a problem airing everyone else's dirty laundry in public. Why should you get to keep yours hidden? I stepped back, letting the moment play out. My part in this confrontation was done, for now. But as I watched Sandra squirm, a thought occurred to me. This wasn't just about exposing her hypocrisy. This was about reclaiming my voice. For years, I'd let her silence me, let her undermine me at every turn. Tonight, I was done being the quiet one. Sandra's attempt to regain control was pitiful at best. She turned to the guests, her voice shaking. I think we've all had enough drama for one night. Why don't we just... No, Claire interrupted, her tone sharp. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. I think we're just getting to the good part. Sandra's face turned a deep shade of crimson. This is none of your business, she hissed. Actually it is, Claire replied coolly. You've been meddling in my company's internal affairs, undermining my team, and frankly, wasting my time. I'd say that makes it very much my business. The room fell silent again, the weight of Claire's words hanging in the air. Sandra looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting around the room in search of an escape. But there was none. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Mom, he said, his voice firm. You need to leave. Sandra stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Ethan, you don't mean that. I'm your mother. And she's my wife, he replied, gesturing toward me. For the first time in years, there was a steeliness in his voice that I hadn't heard before. You've crossed every line imaginable, and I'm done letting you get away with it. Go. Alan didn't wait for Sandra to respond. He picked up her coat from the back of her chair and tossed it onto the table. You heard him, he said coldly. Leave. For a moment, I thought Sandra might fight back. But then she seemed to deflate, her shoulders slumping as she realized she'd lost. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and turned to the table, where the guests were still frozen in place. Well, Claire said after a long pause, lifting her wine glass. That was the most entertaining dinner party I've been to in years. Everyone laughed nervously, the tension in the room beginning to dissipate. But as I looked around, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Sandra might be gone for now, but I knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. And when she came back, I'd be ready. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot. After Sandra stormed out, the tension in the room lingered like smoke. The guests sat quietly, their expressions a mix of disbelief and morbid curiosity, as if they couldn't decide whether to offer me sympathy or applaud me for what had just unfolded. Ethan hadn't moved since telling his mother to leave. He stood by the table, staring blankly at the door she'd slammed behind her, his hands braced against the chair he'd pushed back. But Alan was the wild card. He hadn't followed Sandra out the door. Instead, he lingered near the window, staring out into the night with his arms crossed. He looked as though he was wrestling with something bigger than what had just been revealed. I busied myself clearing plates, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The clatter of dishes broke the silence, but my mind was racing. Sandra's departure had felt victorious, but something about the way Alan had stayed rooted in place unnerved me. He wasn't the type to make scenes, but there was a quiet intensity about him tonight that I couldn't ignore. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Well," she said, setting her wine glass down with a decisive clink. "I think we've all seen enough drama for one evening. But I have to admit, this was illuminating." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp as she looked between me and Ethan. She was assessing us, I realized, not in a judgmental way, but as though she was piecing together a puzzle. "Claire, I'm so sorry for all of this," I said quickly, my voice steady despite the storm still raging in my chest. "This isn't how I wanted the evening to go." She waved a hand dismissively. "Don't apologize. Honestly, I think you handled yourself remarkably well." She turned to Ethan, arching an eyebrow. "Though I'm curious, Ethan, was any of this a surprise to you?" Ethan blinked, as if pulled from a trance. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I guess. I always knew my mom could be difficult, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten." His voice faltered, and he glanced at me, guilt etched across his face. "I should have stood up for you sooner." Before I could respond, Alan spoke, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "It's not just about her being difficult." He turned to face us, his expression hard. "Sandra's been playing her games for years, and I let her. I told myself it was easier to keep the peace than to confront her. But seeing her tonight, seeing how far she's willing to go to hurt the people she's supposed to love," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Alan," I said gently, setting the dishes down and stepping toward him. "I don't blame you for her behavior. None of us do." He shook his head. "You should. I should have stopped her a long time ago. But I didn't because I didn't want to deal with the fallout. And now," he gestured vaguely toward the door, "now it's all blown up anyway." Ethan crossed the room, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, it's not your fault," he said quietly. "But maybe it's time to stop letting her control everything. You don't have to keep protecting her." Alan met Ethan's gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You're right," he said. "I don't." The guests began to excuse themselves shortly after that, murmuring polite goodbyes and offering hesitant smiles as they filed out. Claire was the last to leave, pausing at the door to give me a knowing look. "If you ever need a change of pace," she said, handing me her business card, "give me a call. I think you'd fit in well with my team." I stared at the card, surprised. "Oh, thank you," I stammered. She winked. "You've got a backbone. We could use that." Once the house was empty, I let out a long, shaky breath and turned to Ethan and Alan, who were sitting silently at the table. The house felt eerily quiet now, as though it were holding its breath. "What happens now?" I asked, breaking the silence. Alan looked up, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said slowly, "I deal with Sandra." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. But before I could ask what he meant, he stood and grabbed his coat. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his tone heavy. It was overdue. With that, he left, leaving Ethan and me alone in the dimly lit dining room. "Do you think he'll be okay?" I asked, sitting down across from Ethan. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe this is what it takes for him to finally stand up to her." I nodded, though unease prickled at the edges of my thoughts. Sandra wasn't the type to go quietly, and I had a feeling this wasn't the end of her games. 2 days passed in uneasy silence. Sandra hadn't called, texted, or even sent one of her infamous passive-aggressive emails. At first, I thought maybe she was finally too embarrassed to lash out. But deep down, I knew better. Sandra didn't retreat. She regrouped. And whatever storm she was brewing, it was only a matter of time before it hit. Ethan and I tried to go about our routines, but the tension was thick between us. He was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact and staying buried in his work. I wanted to be angry at him for years of complicity, but I could see he was struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman she really was. On the third night, just as we were sitting down to a late dinner, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. Alan. Ethan answered, his voice cautious. "Dad?" Is everything okay? I couldn't hear what Alan said, but the look on Ethan's face turned my stomach. His eyes widened, and his grip on the phone tightened. She what? He asked, his voice rising.
When?
Where is she now? I stood, my heart pounding. What's going on? Ethan held up a hand, listening intently. Okay, yeah, we'll be there soon. He hung up and turned to me, his face pale. Mom's gone to the house. Our house. I asked, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He nodded. She showed up at Dad's this morning, screaming about how we humiliated her and ruined her reputation. When he wouldn't take her side, she packed some of her things and left. Now she's sitting in our driveway. I grabbed my coat, without a second thought. Let's go. The drive home felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. When we pulled into the driveway, there she was, Sandra, standing by her car with her arms crossed, her face a mask of icy determination. She didn't wait for us to get out of the car. Instead, she marched straight up to Ethan's window, knocking on it like she owned the place. Ethan rolled it down reluctantly. Mom, what are you doing here? She didn't waste time on pleasantries. I'm staying here, she announced, as if it were a foregone conclusion. I blinked, momentarily stunned. Excuse me? Sandra turned her gaze on me, and for the first time in years, her usual smugness was replaced by something colder. You heard me. Alan's turned on me, thanks to you, and I have nowhere else to go. So I'll be staying here. It's the least you can do after everything you've put me through. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. Sandra, I said carefully, you can't just show up here and… I'm his mother, she interrupted, jabbing a finger at Ethan. This is his house. Or did you forget that, like you've forgotten every other thing I've done for this family? Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mom, you can't stay here. You need to go home and sort things out with Dad. Her expression hardened. I don't have a home anymore. Alan's made that perfectly clear. I stepped forward, my patience wearing thin. Sandra, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't going to work. You don't get to waltz in here and act like we owe you something. Her eyes flicked to me, narrowing. You're the one who poisoned my son against me, she said, her voice low and venomous. Don't think I don't know what you're doing. You've always wanted to push me out, and now you think you've won. Won. I repeated, laughing bitterly. Sandra, this isn't a competition. But if it were, you'd be the one who lost. You've spent years tearing everyone down, and now you're surprised that no one's on your side? Ethan stepped between us, holding up his hands. Stop, he said firmly. Both of you. Mom, you can't stay here. I'm sorry, but this isn't your home. You need to leave. Sandra's face crumpled, but there was no sincerity in her expression, only a calculated sadness designed to manipulate. Ethan, she said softly, I'm your mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It does, he replied, his voice steady. But it doesn't mean you can keep treating the people I love like they're disposable. You need to go. She looked at him for a long moment, her mask slipping just enough for me to see the anger simmering beneath the surface. Then, without another word, she turned and climbed into her car. But as she drove away, a chill ran down my spine. Sandra wasn't someone who gave up easily, and something told me this wasn't the end. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of notifications on my phone. At first, I assumed it was work-related, but as I scrolled through the messages, my blood ran cold. Sandra had gone nuclear. She'd taken to social media, posting a long, tearful diatribe about how her ungrateful son and his conniving wife had thrown her out of their lives after years of sacrifice. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, weaving a narrative that twisted every event in her favor. She even posted a picture of herself standing in front of our house, cropped, of course, to make it look like she'd been kicked to the curb. The comments were brutal. Dozens of her friends and distant relatives chimed in, calling Ethan and me heartless, selfish, and worse. A few people tagged me directly, demanding to know how I could treat my mother-in-law so cruelly. Ethan came into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, and saw the look on my face. What's wrong? He asked, his voice heavy with concern. I handed him my phone without a word. As he read through the posts, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger. She didn't, he muttered, scrolling furiously. She didn't. Oh, she did, I said, my voice tight. And now half the family thinks we're monsters. Ethan set the phone down, running a hand through his hair. I'll call her, he said, reaching for his own phone. Don't bother, I snapped, surprising even myself. This isn't a conversation. This is war. He looked at me, startled. What are you saying? I'm saying we're done playing by her rules. I grabbed my laptop and opened the folder I'd shown during the dinner party, the one filled with years of Sandra's cruel comments, manipulative emails, and downright appalling behavior. But this time, I wasn't just going to use it as a private weapon. If Sandra wanted to air our dirty laundry in public, I was more than ready to match her energy. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. What do you need me to do? I smiled grimly. Just follow my lead. We started by drafting a carefully worded statement to post on our social media accounts. I kept it calm and factual, avoiding the emotional traps Sandra had set. It's deeply hurtful when someone you love twists the truth for attention. While we value family, we also believe in boundaries. The decision to ask Sandra to leave was not made lightly and came after years of enduring behavior that crossed every line of respect. For those curious about the full story, we'd be happy to share more privately. Thank you for understanding. Before posting it, I attached screenshots, just enough to offer a glimpse of Sandra's true nature without overwhelming people. I included the email where she'd tried to sabotage Ethan's promotion and a snippet of the recording where she mocked my infertility. It didn't take long for the tide to turn. Within hours, the comments on Sandra's post began to shift. People who had initially rushed to her defense started asking questions. A few brave souls even commented on her post, expressing shock and support. But Sandra wasn't done. That evening, she showed up at Ethan's workplace. Claire, his boss, called him into her office to let him know Sandra was in the lobby, making a scene. She's claiming we forced you into some kind of smear campaign against her, Claire said, arching an eyebrow. Want me to call security? Yes, Ethan said without hesitation. But before security could arrive, Sandra barged into Claire's office. She was wild-eyed and desperate, clutching her phone like a lifeline. You don't understand, she cried. He's my son. This woman, she jabbed her finger in the air, as if I were present, has turned him against me. Claire leaned back in her chair, utterly unimpressed. Sandra, is it? She said, her tone icy. I've already seen the evidence. And I can assure you, the only person responsible for Ethan's choices is you. Sandra's face crumpled, but Claire didn't stop. Now, unless you'd like to embarrass yourself further, I suggest you leave. Otherwise, I'll be happy to file a restraining order on behalf of my employee. Sandra left in a flurry of angry muttering, but not before making one last promise. This isn't over. When Ethan told me what had happened, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Sandra was spiraling, and while it felt good to finally push back, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still holding something over us. What do you think she'll do next? Ethan asked that night as we sat on the couch, both too drained to eat. I shook my head, staring at the blank TV screen. I don't know, I admitted. But whatever it is, we'll be ready. As I said the words, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't afraid of Sandra anymore. Whatever cards she had left to play, they couldn't hurt me. Not really. Because for the first time in years, I had the one thing she couldn't take away, my own voice. The days after Sandra's meltdown passed in a strange quiet, but it wasn't the calm I'd hoped for. It was the eerie stillness before a storm, the kind where you could feel the electricity in the air. I stayed on edge, constantly checking my phone, expecting the next wave of chaos. It came sooner than I thought. Ethan and I were just finishing dinner when Alan called. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. You two need to come to the house, he said.
Now.
Alan, what's going on? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. She's here, Alan said grimly. And let's just say she's not in a good place. We didn't ask questions. We just grabbed our coats and drove to Alan's house, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was Sandra's car parked haphazardly in the driveway, one wheel up on the curb. The house was dark, except for a single light in the living room window. Alan opened the door before we could knock, his face lined with exhaustion. "She's in there," he said, jerking his head toward the living room. "She's been ranting for hours about you, about me, about everything. I've tried talking to her, but she won't listen." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Let me talk to her," he said. I reached out, grabbing his arm. "Ethan, wait." He turned to me, his eyes softening. "I need to do this," he said. Reluctantly, I let him go. Alan and I stayed in the hallway, listening as Ethan stepped into the living room and closed the door behind him. Sandra's voice was sharp and frantic, rising and falling in waves. "You don't understand, Ethan. She's ruining everything. She's turned you against me, against your family. How can you just sit there and let her destroy us?" "Mom," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm, "you're the one destroying us. You've been doing it for years." There was a pause, and then Sandra's voice dropped, trembling. "I did it for you," she said. "Everything I've ever done was for you. To protect you. To make sure you had a good life." "Protect me?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "By insulting my wife? By sabotaging my career? By trying to make me feel like I owe you everything? That's not love, Mom. That's control." "I'm your mother," she snapped. "I deserve respect." "You don't earn respect by tearing other people down," Ethan said. "You've spent your whole life trying to make everyone feel small so you can feel big. And I let you do it because I thought it was easier than standing up to you. But not anymore." The room went silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "So, that's it then? You're choosing her over me?" "I'm choosing peace," Ethan said. "And if that means setting boundaries with you, then yes, I'm choosing her." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but before I could let myself get emotional, the door opened. Ethan stepped out, his expression unreadable. "She's leaving," he said quietly. Alan and I exchanged a glance. "Are you sure?" Alan asked. Ethan nodded. "I told her she needs to get help. Real help. And until she does, she's not welcome in our lives." Alan sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe this is what she needs to finally wake up," he said. Sandra emerged a few minutes later, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at me as she walked past, but just as she reached the door, she turned back to Ethan. "I hope you don't regret this," she said, her voice cold. Ethan didn't respond, and after a moment, she walked out into the night. Alan insisted we stay for a cup of tea before leaving, and as we sat in the quiet kitchen, a strange sense of relief began to settle over me. For the first time in years, I felt like the weight of Sandra's presence was truly gone. On the drive home, Ethan reached over and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "For everything. For not standing up for you sooner. For letting her get away with so much." I squeezed his hand, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "It's okay," I said. "We're here now. That's what matters." The weeks that followed were surprisingly uneventful. Sandra stayed away, and while the silence felt strange at first, it was a welcome change. Ethan and I began to rebuild our lives without her constant interference, and for the first time in years, our home felt like ours again. I don't know if Sandra will ever change, but that's not my responsibility anymore. What I do know is that I've found my voice, and no one, not even her, will ever take that away from me again.